This is C-SPAN's America and the Courts. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia last month heard oral argument on whether a federal judge has the authority to order the release of 17 Chinese Uighur Muslims currently held at the Guantanamo Detention Center. Next, Washington Post federal courts reporter Del Wilber on the oral argument and what's next for the case.
Del Wilber, federal courts reporter for the Washington Post, joining us. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit heard oral argument in the case of 17 Chinese Muslims. What's the case about?
These Muslims, all Uighurs, come from northwestern China, and the Chinese government considers them to be terrorists. They left China and were living in Afghanistan at military-type camps where they were training to perhaps wage war eventually on China. They had some rudimentary weapons training. They were picked up after 2001 in Pakistan, or most of them were, and they were shipped to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, because they had been around some of these camps where maybe some other terrorists had been. The U.S. government has determined that they're no longer enemy combatants. They're not dangerous to the United States. They weren't enemies of the United States, but they can't find any place to put them. They normally would send these guys, once they're no longer enemy combatants, back home. They can't send them back to China because they may be tortured and killed. So they've tried to find third countries to take them. No one wants to take them because they sent some Uighurs to Albania, I believe, in 2005, 2006. And the and other countries now don't want to take them because China really dropped a hammer saying, you cannot take these guys. We consider them terrorists. Imagine how we'd feel if someone shipped al-Qaeda members to some other third country. We'd be upset. So they filed for habeas corpus, a relief, show the body. They were granted the right of habeas corpus to challenge their confinement in federal court here with the Supreme Court decision in Boumediene in June. And now they've been challenging that. The government didn't provide any evidence to justify their continued detentions, and a federal judge ordered them released into the United States, the only remedy he could foresee, because we couldn't send them anywhere else. The government appealed that ruling, and now we're in the Court of Appeals, and we just had an argument before the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit last week. And a three-judge panel heard the case, and the Uighurs attorney said, yes, the federal judge does have the authority to order their release into the United States under the June Supreme Court decision in the other detainees cases. The government says, no, the immigration law prohibits a judge from allowing people to come into this country, ordering people into the United States. Only the president and Congress had that authority. And so that was what the oral argument was about, I believe, last Monday.
Can you tell us more about what the government's argument is in the case?
Yeah, the government argues, in essence, hey, you can't, the court has no constitutional authority to order a release into the country. That's a sovereign power granted to the executive branch as delegated by Congress. They say, listen, and also they may be precluded from entering the country anyway because they trained at a military camp that is affiliated with what was later determined to be a terrorist group by the United States government, I believe in 2004. So if you have those kinds of ties, you're precluded from entering the country anyway. And so that's what their argument is.
How long have the men been held at Guantanamo, and what is the federal government doing to find a place for them?
They're scrambling around trying to find a place to send them, but they've had very little success over the years. They've been trying for years to find them a place. They've been there almost 7 years, I believe. Almost 7 years at Guantanamo Bay. And they're kept in a separate facility, the government says, where they can watch DVDs and stuff and have a little bit more freedom than when they were locked up in other parts of Guantanamo Bay. But the government argues it has, quote, wind-up authority to take care of this, even though they're no longer considered enemy combatants or dangerous. The government did say in some court filings that these guys could be dangerous if released into the United States because they had weapons training. But the other side argues, hey, the same weapons training these guys received in Afghanistan, you or I could receive at a gun range 30 miles away in Virginia.
So what's next in the case?
Well, we're going to wait and see what the judges say. Two of the judges seem to be leaning towards the government side. One judge had already written an opinion in another part of this case that basically backed the Uighur side. After that comes out, if it goes against the Uighurs or it goes for the Uighurs, it'll be appealed, probably ask the entire circuit, all the judges in the circuit here to hear it, or to go to the Supreme Court. But then again, on January 20th, there's a new president in town, and he may take other action. He said he wants to close Guantanamo. Maybe he has his guys offer the Uyghurs asylum in the United States. We take a few. A few others get shipped to other European countries. In some kind of measure. But I think everyone kind of expects a different posture, the government to take a different posture after January 20th.
Del Wilber covers the federal courts for the Washington Post. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's oral.
Now on America and the Courts, a briefing with the attorneys who represent the Chinese Uighur Muslims currently being held at Guantanamo. This is an hour portion of the discussion.
We on this panel are pro bono lawyers. We're Americans and we're patriots, and we've been working for years to try to shed the light of day on our 17 clients and the other men who are in the prison in Guantanamo. Shortly after, I'd like to just go into what Guantanamo is and how people got there. Shortly after 9/11, President Bush declared that his global war on terror was going to be like nothing we've ever seen before. And the central piece, the defining aspect of that war on terror, was the president's detention policy, which truly was like nothing we've ever seen before. The Bush administration felt that the 9/11 was deserving of a military solution and not a law enforcement solution. And with the military solution came the need for intelligence. Intelligence and secrecy. Secrecy from the public, from the courts, and from Congress. And the key way to get intelligence is to interrogate prisoners. And the president was advised and agreed that he was able to, under his own authority, to declare any person, anywhere, anytime to be an enemy combatant, and to take that person and kidnap them, put them in chains, muffle them, blindfold them, and take them to an offshore prison where they were at the complete mercy of their captors. The Geneva Conventions were determined not to apply to these people, and we know that from pictures of Abu Ghraib that the rest is history. The Uighurs present a human face on the mistakes that were made in this war on terror and the detention policy. The Uighurs themselves are from far western, northwestern China. They are an ethnic group that practice a moderate form of Islam, and they have had an independent country until Mao Zedong came in 1949 and overran the country along with Tibet, their neighbors to the south. The Uighurs have been accused of using their own cultural and musical and language to engage in a form of splitism, which the Chinese brand as a kind of terrorism. And they have been heavily and brutally repressed. My clients and these other clients from these lawyers have a similar story. My one client left, Batiar, his name is, he left China to seek a better life. This was in the summer of 2001. He made his way to Pakistan with his life savings and was told that he couldn't make a living with that small amount, but that there was a place in Afghanistan, a Uyghur village, where he could do construction and earn some money and perhaps wait for a visa to get him to Turkey or some other democratic country. At the training camp, which the government calls a terrorist training camp, it was really just a small tumble-down village with a single road. The men engaged in certain construction activities, and things were quite peaceful until the Afghanistan incursion after 2001, when bombs started raining down on their camp. And they were quite surprised because they considered themselves very friendly to the United States. But together they fled and went up into the mountains where there were no roads, and they waited in caves up there until they found a group of men who were traveling over to Pakistan, and they went with them across the border, where they were received warmly by villagers who fed them and clothed them and soon betrayed them. Why did they betray them? Perhaps it's because our government, and as Don Rumsfeld said, dropped leaflets on Pakistan and Afghanistan like snow falling on Chicago in the winter. I have some of these leaflets here. They're right on the Department of Defense website. But tell me if you think this doesn't sound like an American leaflet. It says, "Get wealth and power beyond your dreams. turn in an enemy combatant. You can receive millions of dollars for helping out anti-Taliban forces. This is enough money to take care of your family, your village, your tribe. It sounds like something on Home Shopping Network. So it didn't take much for poor people in Afghanistan to accept this offer and to turn over these men for up to $5,000 a head bounty. The men were then shipped to Guantanamo, where, to our shame, the Americans allowed the Chinese to interrogate them and indeed softened them up for the interrogators by denying them of sleep and food for a period of time before the interrogators came in. So that's the story of how they got there. And I think George can talk about what happened after that.
Good afternoon. I appreciate being given the opportunity to come here and speak. I want to focus on one of my Uighur clients, Anwar Hassan. On September 30th of this year, just recently, the administration finally admitted what it has known for years, that Mr. Hassan, as well as the rest of the Uighurs, are not enemy combatants. Some may say that that makes how we got here, how it came to be that the Uighurs were classified as enemy combatants in the first place, old news, that it's just water under the bridge. It isn't. The reason why it isn't, we'll get to. A little bit of background. 20 years ago this Friday, at the age of 17, I enlisted and served in the United States Marine Corps as an infantryman and as a member of the Marine Security Forces Detachment. Although I was honorably discharged from the Marines in '96, that experience, as you can imagine, lives with me. I know that we're at a war with terrorists, guerrillas, and others that would use any means at their disposal to strike us, here and abroad. I know we need to win that war. I greatly respect and am thankful for those that are taking the fight to the enemy right now as we speak. I have friends among them. But no aspect of winning this war will ever be advanced by imprisoning people as enemy combatants years after we determined that they are not, years after we knew they were not enemy combatants. So how we got here, why we're sitting here today, very much matters. Mr. Hassan is similarly situated to the rest of the Uighur community in Guantanamo. The men that Ms. Gilson just discussed, the men that Mr. Willett's going to discuss. He was purchased from the Pakistanis in late 2001 or early 2002 and found himself, unfortunately, in Guantanamo shortly thereafter. Within a year of his capture, military officials determined that, quote, Mr. Hassan was not fighting for the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, and that, quote, he does not represent a threat to the United States or its interests. That was the military 5 years ago. When the CSRT process was finally established in 2004, a CSRT panel determined that Mr. Hassan was not properly classified as an enemy combatant. That's right, not properly classified as an enemy combatant. 5 other Uighur men were similarly found not to be enemy combatants. This decision apparently did not sit well with the administration. While we do not have all the details, and while some of the details that we do have cannot be disclosed outside of a classified session, we do know and can disclose some of the following. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs instructed the military to reconsider its classification of Mr. Hassan and the 5 other Uighur men. In that communication, he noted that, quote, 16 other Uighurs with identical circumstances were determined to be enemy combatants. Based on this instruction, a military officer conducted what he referred to as a, quote, inculpatory search. Now, it turns out that inculpatory is not actually a word, but it sounds a lot like inculpatory. I leave you to decide that yourself. He also relayed 2 points to the chair of a new CSRT panel for Mr. Hassan, and there's a blow-up someplace that has these on it. And I'll just pick the highlights out. The first point was that, quote, inconsistencies will not cast a favorable light on the CSRT process or the work done by ORDEC. ORDEC, for the uninitiated, is the Office of Administrative Review for the Detention of Enemy Combatants. It's a long one. The second point was that by properly classifying them as enemy combatants, then there is an opportunity to further exploit them here in Gitmo, and when they are transferred to a third country, it will be controlled transfer in status. The consensus is that all Uighurs will be transferred to a third country as soon as the plan is worked out. These are not my words, this is the military's words. That itself was 3 years ago. Although the 5 other Uighur non-combatants, as Mr. Sternal is going to talk to you about in a minute, were eventually released to Albania, there was never a, quote, controlled transfer in status, or any other transfer of Mr. Hassan. He sits in Gitmo, a man who, when left to its own devices, the United States military determined was not an enemy combatant, remained classified as one because any other result would have been inconsistent. Any other result would, quote, not cast a favorable light on the CSRT process or the work done by the DoD office that oversees that process. That's why he's an enemy combatant. Simply put, Mr. Hassan's freedom would have required the administration to admit error. It wouldn't, so he was classified and imprisoned as an enemy combatant, even though he wasn't. Some may say that what happened to Mr. Hassan, while unfortunate, is not symptomatic of a broader problem in the detention practices and procedures of the War on Terror. I hope they're right. I hope that Mr. Hassan's situation was caused by the overzealousness of a few and an acute rather than chronic lack of proper oversight. Based on the information we have, however, it appears much more likely that Mr. Hassan's situation, if it is an exception, is not a rare exception. The process established to determine who is and who is not an enemy of this nation is systemically flawed. Perhaps we should not be surprised. The CSRT process relies on secret evidence presented in a one-sided manner with no effective opportunity for rebuttal and no adversarial challenges. It applies a definition of enemy combatant that is both contrary to the military's own handbooks and field manuals and broad enough to compass, as Justice Department attorneys have actually admitted, a little old lady who unwittingly funds a charity the administration doesn't like. Such a process at the very least enables, if it does not outright encourage, the sort of abuses of classification and detention powers seen in Mr. Hassan's case. That's what happened to Mr. Hassan. And I realize we're here to talk about other things, but if I may, I encourage the members and staff to investigate the situation of the Uighurs generally and Mr. Hassan specifically in Guantanamo. It's important to determine how they came to be there, when it was first determined that they were not enemy combatants, why they were held beyond that time, why and how they were erroneously classified as enemy combatants. I submit that this investigation should not be focused on placing blame on the military personnel involved in any given decision. Rather, it should be focused on determining what is wrong with the process and how we fix it. As we sit comfortably in this room, our warriors are making detention decisions that seriously affect our national security and their lives. To the extent we can improve the process by which those decisions are made, we owe it both to them and to the next group of innocent men that, like the Uighurs, were unlucky enough to find themselves at the mercy of this great nation. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today. Mr. Sternal.
Thank you, George. I represent 4 of the Uighur men in Guantanamo, and in considering whether it would be appropriate to settle these men here in the United States, it's worth noting that 5 identically situated Uighurs, some of whom you see before you in these photographs, were released from Guantanamo in May 2006 and have been living peacefully in Europe ever since. The cases of these 5 men presented identical facts to those of 13 of the Uighurs who remained detained in Guantanamo to this day. All 18 were living in the same Uighur expatriate community in Afghanistan prior to September 11, 2001. Due to the fundamentally arbitrary nature of the CSRT process, the Defense Department eventually determined that these 5 were not enemy combatants, while it initially reached the opposite conclusion as to their companions. All 5 eventually filed petitions for habeas corpus. In December 2005, Judge James Robertson of the U.S. District Court in Washington held that the detention of these men was unlawful. Nevertheless, he concluded that he had no authority to order their release. The case was appealed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and was scheduled for oral argument on Monday, May 9, 2006. Late in the afternoon on Friday, May 6, just days before this crucial hearing, we received word that our clients were flown to Tirana, Albania. Mr. Willett and I both visited our clients in Tirana shortly after they arrived there. We found them living in a refugee center operated by the Albanian government. The refugee center was located on the outskirts of Tirana, in the middle of a slum, on a potholed road strewn with garbage. It had high walls, bars on the windows, and an armed guard at the gate. Initially, our clients were told that they would not be permitted to leave the refugee center, and it was only after we demanded that the U.S. Embassy staff intervene that they were allowed to venture into Tirana. It soon became clear that the Albanian government was ill-equipped to address the needs of such a unique refugee population. Albania has no Uighur community to speak of, and there was not a single person in the country who spoke their language. For a brief period, our clients were given Albanian language classes. but these classes stopped because of budget constraints. The absence of a Uyghur community in Tirana has made it very difficult for our clients to integrate successfully into Albanian society, having been deprived of the traditional avenues to employment that most new immigrants rely on. But in spite of these tough odds, our clients have made every effort to rebuild their lives and become self-sufficient. Ayub Haji Mehmet, who was only 18 years old when he arrived at Guantanamo, had been trying to obtain a student visa to study in the United States before he was captured in Pakistan. Ayub excelled as a student in China, and his parents had arranged for him to stay with distant relatives here in the event that he was able to obtain a U.S. visa. After he arrived in Albania, Ayub hoped to once again continue his education. He began taking English lessons at a local language school with the generous assistance of an American donor, and eventually transferred to the University of New York, Tirana, which is affiliated with the State University of New York. Ayub is now working towards a degree in computer science. The other men were much older than Ayub. They had little formal education and had worked mostly as manual laborers and small merchants. They hoped to find work in Tirana with the assistance of the Albanian government, but unfortunately, that assistance has not been forthcoming. Albania remains one of the poorest countries in Europe, and the unofficial unemployment rate could be as high as 30%. Despite these challenges, our clients have done their best to find work. The oldest of the five, Abu Bakr Qasim, has been volunteering his time at a local restaurant. Among other things, this has allowed him to improve his Albanian language skills and to learn the restaurant business. He hopes to soon find a permanent job and eventually to open up his own business. One of the five, Adol Abdul Hakim, left Albania in November 2007 after he was granted a 4-day visa to travel to Sweden to lecture about human rights in Stockholm. Since his sister lived in Sweden, he applied for asylum there. Although his application for asylum was denied, he's currently appealing that decision, and in the meantime is living with his sister and helping to care for her young children. While these men have suffered immeasurably, they know that their hardships pale in comparison to those of their 17 Uyghur brothers who remain in Guantanamo to this day. With the exception of Ali Hassan, whom Mr. Clark just spoke of, these men were inexplicably classified as enemy combatants by the CSRTs. Ali's CSRT was later ordered to conduct a do-over until it reached the same result. With the assistance of the lawyers before you today, these 17 men filed habeas corpus petitions in 2005 and 2006. But this litigation stalled after Congress passed the Detainee Treatment Act and later the Military Commissions Act, which attempted to strip these men of their habeas rights. As the appellate courts wrestled with the constitutional questions posed by that legislation, most of the Uyghurs decided to file petitions under the Detainee Treatment Act, believing that even under the very narrow review afforded by the DTA, they could still prove their innocence. They prevailed. This past June, a 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit, composed of 2 Republican-appointed judges and 1 Democratic appointee, held that one of the Uyghurs, Hussefa Parhat, was not an enemy combatant. The court rebuked the evidence presented by the government as insufficient, unreliable, and based on attenuated guilt by association reasoning. The circuit court ordered the government to release Parhat, to transfer him, or to expeditiously convene a new CSRT to consider evidence submitted in a manner consistent with the court's opinion. The circuit court also directed that Parhat could pursue a habeas proceeding in the district court immediately. The status determinations of the remaining Uyghurs relied on the same assertions and reasoning as that of Parhat. So the U.S. government conceded that the D.C. Circuit's decision in Parhat would apply equally to the remaining 16 Uyghurs, that none would be subjected to new CSRTs, and that all would be treated as non-enemy combatants. We subsequently filed a motion for their immediate release into the United States, or for parole into the United States pending the conclusion of their habeas petitions. The government opposed our motion, arguing that the district court lacked the authority to order our clients' release into the United States, but also that these men were too dangerous to be set free here. However, although it was afforded every opportunity to do so, the government declined to offer any evidence of their alleged dangerousness. Indeed, at oral argument, the government confessed that it had no information as to the security threat posed by any one of these men. On October 7th, DC District Court Judge Ricardo Urbina heard the case of Kiyemba v. Bush, the consolidated habeas petition on behalf of all 17 Uighurs. After hearing arguments from both sides, Judge Urbina ruled that the Uighurs should be released from Guantanamo Bay and immediately brought to the United States for a subsequent hearing on the conditions of their release. However, the government sought and received from the D.C. Circuit a stay pending a final resolution of the government's appeal on the merits. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. And Natalie and Hans, thanks very much for having us. A long time ago, a man from Central Europe fled the oppression of the communists, and he came to this country, became a distinguished congressman. And today, the Human Rights Commission is named after Tom Lantos. How ironic, then, that at Guantanamo Bay, we have men who fled from communist persecution and yet remain in prison this afternoon. And it was nice of Natalie to say all those extravagant things about us lawyers, but the fact of the matter is we haven't been able to get our clients out, even though they're not enemies and they're not criminals and they're not anything. I'm not sure we can put that on our resumes, actually. Here's how long our clients have been in a military prison after the government determined that they weren't the enemy. The entire Second World War and more. And if the government wins today on the arguments that it made this morning in the Court of Appeals, they may be there for the rest of their lives. Because the government's position is, it doesn't really matter if you win your habeas case. We don't have to let you out unless some other country solves this problem for us. Because we certainly don't have to solve it for ourselves by bringing them into the United States, even though they're not the enemy, even though they're not criminals, even though when the government was asked for any evidence that there would be a security risk, they said they hadn't quite found any after 7 years. Here's the strange world that we operate in. According to the Bush administration, our clients are not in prison at all. They're housed. That's the word they use. They're housed at Guantanamo. Well, we went down to meet them a month ago in this house, and we asked, could we meet them without them being chained to the floor of the house? And the government rushed into court to say, well, no, that would be interfering with how we manage our prisons. So when it's convenient, it's a prison. But when you're in the Court of Appeals, it's a house. Here's what I know about this house. Huzaifa Parhat, who was ordered released 5 months and 4 days ago, handed me a letter to his son. His son is 10 years old. The letter was read to me. It's the sort of letter that a father might write to a son after 7 years. I didn't notice any secrets in the letter. It was things like, say your prayers and go to school and be respectful to your elders, and I miss you. That letter can't be sent to his son because, you see, it would violate military regulations to give a letter to your lawyer. And so it's sitting at a secure facility in the Pentagon from which it will be sent back to him. So you tell me if that's a house or a prison. What we saw today was another round of a kind of interminable appellate badminton that happens in the courts. Some of the press asked me afterwards, when will there be a decision? Well, the answer probably is not soon. And after the decision, there'll be another appeal by somebody, and maybe something called en banc, whatever that is. And it goes on and on and on. What all of this means is that the court is not a very efficient way to resolve the larger problem of Guantanamo. We might actually get justice in a case or two before these men die of old age. I don't know. But if you're talking about resolving the problem of Guantanamo, we need something more. We need the other two branches of government to step up. Particularly when you consider the force of the government's argument today, which was, nobody can make us turn these people loose. Unless some other country does it, we don't have to do it. Now, if they're right about that, all of that excitement last week about the Boumediene case is kind of beside the point. Because if the Bosnians don't take Boumediene home, he sits in Guantanamo for the rest of his life. That's the way the Bush administration sees it. I don't think that's the way the country sees it anymore. I don't think that's the way the country saw it on November 4th. I think they looked in the mirror and they didn't quite like what they were seeing and said, we're better than that. I think the country really wants a change, and it wants to get past this dreadful reputational hit that we've taken all around the world in Guantanamo. So now the Democrats have both the benefit and the burden of owning the problem. They have control in Congress, and they will shortly have the White House. And it is up to those two branches of our government to end this problem quickly. Now, the good news is it lies exclusively within the power of the president to do just that. The president, by showing leadership, by, for example, paroling on the first day of his administration these Uighurs, who were, as George said, cleared by the military years ago, into this country, would send an example around the world like a lightning bolt to the many other allies who would like to help us in this regard, but just can't get past the arrogance of, we made this problem, but you need to fix it. If America shows some leadership in fixing it, we have a lot of friends and a lot of people who are frankly overjoyed that we seem to have returned to the angel of our better nature. But it will take that leadership, and it takes it soon. This process is going on too long. Here's how long it's going on. My wife is a teacher. And not so long ago, the fifth graders were giving their reports, travelogues. They had each picked a state, and they had to explain the points of interest in the state. Keep in mind, fifth graders, 10 years old. One child had picked Hawaii, and she was explaining why she had picked Pearl City as a place to visit. And it was because they have a harbor there called Pearl Harbor, and that's where 9/11 happened. You see, these events happened a long time ago, and people are forgetting exactly what happened. That's why we need to put it behind us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, all of you, for your thoughtful presentations. And Hans, did you want to start off? Let's open it up to the audience. Does anybody have a question for our panel?
I have a question. Why don't you tell us who these guys are? We've heard about them, but not in terms of the pictures.
Jason, would you be the best person to comment on who?
Since we can't see them.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. Why don't we just go from left to right here? So as Michael informed us a little earlier, 5 of our clients, 2 clients of Bingham & McCutcheon, 3 clients of Kramer Levin, were transferred to Albania in May of 2006. We have 4 of their photos up here. The first individual on the left with the little girl, I believe is Fatima, that's his niece? Yep. Is Adele. Adele was one of the petitioners in the Qasim case that Michael also talked about earlier. And he is the individual that was transferred to Sweden on a visa and actually spoke at a human rights conference with Sabin, which was a thrilling experience for both of them and for everyone involved. To the right of Adele, we have Ayub, who is a Kramer-Levin client. And Michael, I don't know if you want to give any background on Ayub.
Sure. Ayub is actually the young man who I mentioned earlier. Ayub was 18 years old when he was picked up along with 17 other Uighurs in Pakistan. And Ayub has an interesting story. When he left his family in China, he was on his way to Pakistan, where he was going to stay with a family friend who was going to try to help him get a student visa to come to the United States, stay with relatives, and eventually go to college. When I met with Ayub in Albania in 2006, he sort of jokingly said, you know, I was hoping to get an education from the Americans, but Guantanamo wasn't what I really had in mind. But he had a very rough time in Guantanamo, but he's actually doing very, very well right now. He's in the second year of an undergraduate program in computer science, and he's I think really making a very valiant effort to rebuild his life after a fairly nightmarish experience.
Thank you. And I think the point that gets lost here, amongst all this wrangling in the courtroom and disputes over which legal theory applies and separation of powers and all this, which are extremely important, is that there are real people down in Guantanamo that really did not do anything wrong and have sat in a cell now for 7 years. So I'm going to tell you about the third person from your right. This is Abu Bakr Qasim. This is the second of the petitioners and the namesake of the Qasim case. This is the case of 2 non-enemy combatant Uighurs filed in 2005, and this is sort of the predicate for the group transfer to Albania in 2006. And the last individual to the right here, if I'm not mistaken, is Ahmed, and that's another, I don't know if you can see him.
We can't see. No, we can't see any of them.
Oh.
You can't see any of them.
They're blocked by, they're all blocked by each other. And you're.
I could swing them around if that would be good for you. All right.
I have a question for the panel as Jason's swinging his documents. It does seem that at this point the ball falls in the president-elect's court. And I also have heard, as I think you all have, that our allies aren't going to step forward in terms of accepting some of these detainees until we ourselves accept some into the country. We have tried to encourage some openness on the part of some Europeans to accept some clear detainees. What is your sense? I mean, you spoke, Sabin, about, how great it would be if the president did parole the Uighurs. Does anybody have a sense as to what might be happening after?
Well, it's funny you asked that. Some of our colleagues in the last couple of days have been in Europe meeting with a number of representatives of foreign ministries and NGOs over there, and essentially all of those folks are begging the U.S. to show leadership here, because not only are they willing to support, they want to support, because all of the civilized world wants an end to Guantanamo. It doesn't help anyone in the larger struggle against the real enemies that George mentioned that we have, to continue this recruiting poster that we have down there in Cuba to our enemies. So there is, we sense, a tremendous sort of latent ability to solve this problem, but it does require the U.S. to show leadership, and what better case than the Uighurs?
Sigmund, in the same vein, this morning in the hearing, I think the government made the argument again, well, we still have efforts going on trying to find a safe third country from them. Well, I think at one point, particularly here on Capitol Hill, the question arises, how long are these efforts going to go on for? I mean, when do we finally say we cannot come to an agreement, there is no country? Because this isn't something that we started yesterday. Right. This is obviously an ongoing effort that has been going on forever.
In August 2004, General Powell, who was then Secretary of State, talked about the then ongoing efforts to resettle the Uighurs. All the court stuff since then was a kind of pretextual public relations game in order to delay any judicial inquiry into who these people are, the government's hope being that it would be able to resettle them somewhere and then the case would go away. But the fact of the matter is, we've run into this problem all over the world with the government saying, well, if they're so innocent, why won't you take them? Should we be worried about something? We see these legal briefs that get written about terrorism. So the government has to stop with the public relations and get to the facts and take a few of these innocent folks here, and then I think you'll find the Guantanamo problem can be solved pretty quickly.
Yeah. Just to follow up on your clients, and to the extent that you can, it must be obviously extremely hard for people in Guantanamo to go through its back and forth, and having an order that you're going to be released and are not released, and can you describe the mental health of, or the the well-being of your clients in Guantanamo?
Well, I have two comments on that, and it's a very good question. I was at Guantanamo visiting the men on November 5th, the day after the election. And there's not much you can say to them that gets them enthusiastic, since they've been told that they didn't belong in Guantanamo in the first place. They've been told that the Parhat decision resulted in an order of release, that the Urbina decision was an order of release. So that when I told them about President, and I can talk about what I've said, my notes aren't cleared yet as to what they said, but I can say they have no stars in their eyes. They were appropriately subdued and hopeful. I think that Obama was elected, but right now it's hard to get them to be hopeful about anything. The state of their mental health was particularly precarious during the 2 years that they were held in solitary confinement in metal boxes, 6 by 12, with no windows except for 3-inch panels at the front with the view of a clock and a soldier walking by. It was extremely loud. The only way they could communicate was through the bean hole, which, if it was open, they could shout to each other. And over the din, perhaps be heard, perhaps hear someone. In my case, it's 2 brothers. There was no way the 2 brothers could console each other. And the men started to exhibit incredible signs of what I have since learned from psychiatrists to be post-traumatic distress. Or stress. I thought it was schizophrenia, hearing voices, uncontrollable foot tapping, and various very, very troubling symptoms of distress. And since that time, it's been somewhat less noticeable, but they are still, as Sabin pointed out, in a prison, in a bigger prison, on an island where they can't get off, and they're very well aware of it.
Have their conditions improved at all since they are now? Do they have access to? They're living in a communal facility.
It's a communal facility, but it's filled with these huts, and so there's no room really for them to recreate in any way. I don't think you could kick a soccer ball around. There is it's no grass under their feet. It's just gravel. But they are free to walk around there. I can only say it's more restrictive than any minimum security prison that we have in America. And they, in order to meet them one-on-one, they have to be chained to the floor. And we have to otherwise shout through a fence to talk to them.
Question?
Do you have any reaction to the information that's coming out of the session, the court session on the appeals court state Urbina ruling by 2-to-1 vote?
Could you tell us the headline?
Well, I'm just reading a BlackBerry missive here. A state at 2-to-1 questioning of the attorneys that appeared judges might be inclined to overturn Urbina's real ruling. This is Washington Post.
This is from today's. That it sounded like unlikely that you guys are going to succeed. Is that what your sense is?
Can you also identify yourself? Just for
I'm Voice of America. Yeah.
Well, I would say that the questioning from one of the judges was very hostile to our position. From one of the others was very favorable, and from the one in the middle was Sphinx-like. So it's hard to say what will happen. But when anytime you have that type of a contest, it may take time in order to form even a majority of 2. So I don't know what result we're going to see.
Yes. Could you identify yourself?
I wonder if you can comment on this concern that the White House and some of the government lawyers put out that the Uyghurs may pose a security threat, not only to the Americans but also to Uyghur Americans, which I find quite nonsensical. But could you talk about whether that should be a concern or should not be a concern to the Americans who have been so welcoming to Uyghur Americans in the last decade or so?
Yeah, the question was whether there's any security threat, and I hadn't heard this before, but some security threat to the actual Uyghur American families who. Well, the White House press secretary has not always been infallible in the past, but. What I would say simply is this. Judge Urbina in October put the same question to the government's lawyers. Is there a security risk? He basically begged them. There's a page of transcript where he's asking them again and again, tell me something, give me a fact. And the answer was, we don't have any facts. There's no security risk. We're not aware of any security risk. We've read every document there is. We've met these people a dozen times, you know. The government can't come up with a security risk. You know, at some point, it's just shadows in the closet. And I think the real thing is, if we could have human beings in this room today instead of these photographs, it would take you about 3 minutes to get comfortable about the security risk issue. But as long as it's strange-sounding names of faraway people who look different and talk a funny language, it's easy to get people scared, and that's what's happening.
It's also really easy to hide behind the classification procedures. I mean, there's a lot that we can't tell you about that are in the files. And that's one thing that I think, to the extent that the subcommittee can access the actual classified files, I've been saying this for at least 2 years, they should do that, because there's information in there that goes at this question. And basically, in our response in the D.C. Circuit, we filed a classified supplement that explained the classified evidence, and there was no classified reply. They did not reply to it.
There's another irony about this. By claiming that these men pose any kind of danger or even a threat of a danger in America, how can our government then go to the civilian populations of other countries, our allies, and say they can fit in here but not in America?
Too dangerous for
and
us,
what?
not for you.
Right. I think the danger is that they might get a microphone.
Yes. Maybe you all could was there a question?
Yes, Troy Ware. I'm with the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. My question has to do with China, and if someone could perhaps expand on their role in this process, pressuring countries not to take these detainees, or even the treatment of these detainees' families in China.
Let's take that one.
Well, I'll dive in first. When Michael and I went to Albania, the Chinese almost beat us there. When we were there, it was all over the press that the Chinese foreign minister was demanding a meeting with the prime minister of Albania. You know, everywhere, according to our NGO friends who get a lot of information about the State Department's resettlement efforts, every time, you know, our State Department people are walking into an office, the Chinese minister is walking out of the office. So they have been working around the clock everywhere in the world to essentially threaten other countries not to take these people on pain of some kind of commercial, you know, at least commercial penalty. And the result has been, when you combine that with the fact that we made this problem, not the rest of the world says, why isn't America helping to fix the problem? Now, that's not to say there aren't other countries that would help us, even with the Uighurs, if we showed leadership. But it's clear that the United States needs to step up here, or the problem isn't going to get solved.
I'll just add one thing to that. One of the most enjoyable experiences I've had throughout this process is shortly after these men were released and sent to Albania, they were actually given a phone by the Albanian government. They were given access to a cheap cell phone. So for the first time, we were able to speak with them by phone, which is not something you can do when your clients are detained in Guantanamo. And through the magic of conference call technology, we could actually arrange conference calls where they could speak with their families in China. And in some cases, they were speaking to their families for the first time in 5 or 6 years. We had experiences where some of our clients' families were hearing their voices for the first time in 5 or 6 years after having assumed that they were dead. They found the experience so enjoyable and fulfilling that they asked us to set up these calls almost daily for some time. And then at some point they stopped asking for us to arrange those calls because they heard from their families that every time they made a call, their families received a knock at the door a few hours later from the Chinese police who had been listening in. And eventually their families said, stopped calling because I'm tired of getting these visits. I know that you're okay, and that's all that I really need to know.
I think that underscores Nuri's point about how dangerous it is to virtually threaten the Uyghur community in America, which itself is made up of refugees from this communist China and is used to knocks on the doors. The fact that they are opening their hearts and their doors to these men, should the happy day ever occur when they are released, says a great deal about that community.
Could I ask you to explain to the audience what exactly,
Sure.
It seemed to me like a remarkable response that came from the Uyghur community.
And I just could not underestimate to you the danger that not just these men are facing, but all Uyghurs in China. Nuri's parents couldn't come to his wedding because their passports, like every other Uyghurs, have been confiscated in China. They are cracking down, they're flooding the Uyghur homeland with Han Chinese. The Han Chinese, they are forbidding the Uyghurs from learning Chinese so that they can't get any good jobs. There's imprisonments, knocks on the door again in the middle of the night. What we found when we, in the process of hoping to get the men released before Judge Urbina ever issued his order, we put together an entire program of what would happen to these men if they were released, and we had a huge outpouring. One group of mosques, synagogues, and churches in Tallahassee offered to take 3 of the men, give them jobs, driver's licenses, cell phones. Another group in Washington, D.C. area, through the good auspices of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, a very large organization, has not only offered to set up housing and jobs and social services, but the Uyghur community itself came forward and said, not only will we serve as a bridge, a cultural bridge between these men and the American hosts, but we ourselves will give them a comfortable family environment to stay in for a couple nights, and as a bridge between their entry and their relocation into some of the scattered site housing. The good offices of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is our co-counsel in all these cases and which has coordinated all the Guantanamo cases, found a donor who agreed to provide a substantial amount of money, not to support these people, but to help them get on their feet. So it was an incredible outpouring, and you realize we are a nation of immigrants. I thought, why am I so surprised? But it was still very moving because of the libel and falsehoods that have been leveled against these men because they happen to have been picked up and brought to Guantanamo.
If I could just say one thing about that, I also was thinking that the U.S. government, when it goes in search of homes for so many people it calls security threats, had often indicated that they wanted a security guarantee from whatever country would step in and take these individuals. And I know that Rabia Kadir, the Uyghur dissident who resides in this Washington, D.C. area, had indicated that she was willing to herself provide the guarantee for these individuals, that they would not get into any trouble. And I thought of it, you know, what better guarantee than one from Ms. Kadir? It's far better than that from, you know, many countries that we have sent people to, and a guarantee from this individual who is worshipped by so many Uyghur Americans, and also these Uyghurs at Guantanamo.
So I have one other question, which is something that happened apparently, and Amnesty was reporting this relatively early on, which is that the United States and the Guantanamo authorities apparently allowed a Chinese delegation to visit the Uyghurs, clearly against their own wishes, because I don't think that any of your clients had any intentions of meeting with those people that would be very interested in gathering as much information to possibly execute them upon return, which is exactly what our government is fearing, what is happening. Why on earth is that happening, or why did we allow that to happen? Now, I do understand about the international treaties about consular notification and all this kind of thing, but what if the client does not want to see representatives of the embassies? And why did we collaborate in that, which to me is absolutely outrageous?
Well, it's a remarkable story about why the Bush administration collaborated. It takes you back to the summer of 2002. which was the period leading up to the Iraq War. That was the period when the incendiary speeches were being made about weapons of mass destruction, about the next cloud being a mushroom cloud, and so on. And so at that point, the Bush administration was trying to gather support for a UN resolution to authorize an Iraq invasion. And who sits on the Security Council but China? So one of the nations whose support was necessary was China, which is why on August 26, 2002, Richard Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State, was in Beijing to meet the foreign minister. Naji Sabri, who was at that time Saddam Hussein's foreign minister, was in Beijing at the same time, and they were each lobbying for Chinese support for Iraq invasion plans, and we won. But on the ticket from the Chinese foreign minister was a series of things that they wanted, and among them was, we want to go to Guantanamo Bay and interrogate those Uighurs you've got down there. So sure enough, this is August 26, 2002. On September 6, 2002, a Uighur dissident group was put on the State Department's terrorist list. And sometime later in September 2002, the communist interrogators were welcomed to the base where they interrogated our people. And in October 2002, Prime Minister Jiang Zemin, then Prime Minister of China, was welcomed to the Bush Ranch at Crawford. So do the math on why these guys were interrogated.
This was an hour portion of the briefing. You can watch this discussion in its entirety at cspan.org. Just click on America and the Courts under the C-SPAN series link. And join us next week for America and the Courts, Saturday evenings at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN.
President-elect Barack Obama holds a news conference tomorrow